presentation.
It is such an honor and a privilege to be here and to be part of what I hope is going to become really a vibrant civil society movement, as Martin has been describing. I think both Charles and Martin have already talked about so many of the important points, that what I'm doing is really providing a few footnotes to that discussion that I think would round it off. You heard already, I think, from both of them, how Sri Lanka is not alone, Sri Lanka is not unique. In fact, with debt, I always feel there is this famous first line in Tolstoy's War and Peace. You must have heard of it, many of you, that every happy family is happy in its own way. Every happy family is happy in the same way. An unhappy family is unhappy in its own and very different way. They're all different. In debt, that's not true. Unhappy debtor countries are all unhappy in the same way. And you may think that yours is particular and unique and faced because of the domestic political economy and the kinds of regime you have, the corrupt regime, etc., etc. But in fact, the basic processes are identical. And those have already been outlined for you by Martin very clearly, so I'm not going to elaborate them. But I think it's important to stress this because I keep hearing this narrative every time I'm in Sri Lanka about corruption causing the debt crisis. And it's interesting that this is a narrative that is most popular among the elites, who are actually the beneficiaries of that corruption. And they're all saying, yes, it was this terrible Rajapaksa family, they took all the bribes, and they did all this fancy spending, and they took these international sovereign bonds and then spent it any way they wanted in all kinds of vanity projects, and that's why we're in this mess. That is one part of the problem, but it's maybe, 5% of the problem. It's not zero, definitely, and I'm not saying corruption is good. No, I think corruption is terrible and so on. But you cannot blame your debt crisis on that corruption. Because many countries, there are 72 right now, whom the IMF has identified as in debt stress. Many of these countries did not have corrupt governments. Many of them did not misspend the money that they had borrowed. Zambia, for example, was investing in infrastructure and in all of the things that it's supposed to be doing with the debt. It is global changes that causes all of them to fall prey to the same kinds of disease at the same time. There is, of course, the fact that how did all these countries get into so much debt? What is this whole international sovereign bond thing? You never had international sovereign bonds until very recently. I think in Sri Lanka it started in 2009. And the really big increase comes after 2014. So how come? Is it because Sri Lanka decided that it was a good idea and went out of the market? No, it's because the market decided that Sri Lanka should be the beneficiary of investments in these sovereign bonds. And what was happening in Sri Lanka was happening in many, many other countries. You will have heard the terms emerging markets and frontier markets, right? So emerging markets are the countries that the World Bank identifies way back in the 1980s as the countries, usually middle-income countries, that can get access to global capital markets. Okay? By the 2000s, you have this new term, frontier markets. Which are those? These are the countries that could never get access to capital markets because they were seen as too risky. They were low-income countries, they were prone to various kinds of shocks, they had very high concentration of exports, and basically international capital wouldn't touch them. But after the global financial crisis, now remember that happened in the United States. It began in the United States, the one that is going on telling everybody about how they have to now manage their financial systems. Yeah? That one had such terrible implications for the global economy that the advanced economies released huge amounts of what we call liquidity, money supply into the system. They pushed huge amounts of resources onto the banks. Basically, you're putting the patient on life support. You're giving constant blood transfusions of money to keep that global capitalism functioning. So these big banks were given huge amounts of resources at very, very low interest rates and then looking for somewhere to put it. So there's all this money sloshing around the globe. And that's why many emerging markets like Sri Lanka suddenly get access to lots of these bonds. And in fact, you have potential bondholders actually coming and suggesting to governments, you should consider this. It's a very cheap way of getting money. It's much better than your domestic interest rate, even if you don't necessarily need it for your foreign exchange requirement. You have this money sloshing around the globe to countries like Ghana, to countries like Chad, to countries like Zambia. All kinds of countries suddenly got lots of private loans because it was seen as, well, it's zero cost money, so we can put a little bit here. Doesn't really matter very much. We can get a benefit, some profit we will make from it. But of course, you're very risky. So we are going to ask for very high returns because you might default. And so we are insisting that we will give you this money, but it will be much higher in terms of the return than we would expect for the United States or for the European economies or for many of these other economies. Now, in the Sri Lanka case, there was a further issue. It's actually shocking to realize that you have had 48 years of IMF agreement since 1965. Out of how many? I mean, that tells you something. And that tells you something not just about Sri Lanka, it tells you much more about the IMF. Okay. Many of the things that Martin has described, you don't even need, you can just look at that one figure and say, oops, there's a problem here. And really, what was happening in, let's say, 2014, Sri Lanka was at that time in an IMF agreement. It was having difficulty repaying its loans from the World Bank and the IMF. Yes, because the Rajapakshas had also invested it in lots of white elephant projects, etc. Okay, so there were all these issues. They are encouraged by the IMF to go to the international bond market and issue bonds, and then that money is used to pay off the IMF and the World Bank. Now, there is a term in economics, Ponzi financing. There's a famous speculator called Ponzi in New York in the early 20th century, who basically promised everybody 30% loan returns. And the way he did it is, he tells you, I'll give you 30% return, you give your money to me, and then I tell the next person, he says, okay, 30%, and I take his money and repay the first guy. You borrow to repay the loans that you have taken. And we know that that has to end in tears, right? That's a pyramid scheme that's going to collapse. The IMF's, it happened under the IMF's watch. The IMF had a program, it was cheering the Sri Lankan government on in doing this issue of ISDs. Davos, the World Economic Forum, celebrated your finance minister, your prime minister, your president for doing all of this. So there is a serious culpability of this international financial institution, and that culpability is very much part of what Martin was saying. Whose interests is it serving? Is it serving the interests of the country that is taking this loan? Because you know that that loan eventually is going to become this huge problem and you're going to have a major debt crisis. Or is it serving the interests of the financiers who are looking for profitable avenues to park their wealth? Okay? If that is the case, and we now have this knowledge about what the IMF is doing, it really means that we have to change the way we look at it. And exactly as Martin said, it's political. It's not just this technical thing. Okay? It's not about the debt sustainability analysis, which is the gold standard of this analysis, and they have all the answers about whether your debt is sustainable or not. You will have to accept their numbers, not just you, the Paris Club, the Global Debt Roundtable, the Common Framework, everybody accepts the IMF's numbers. But the IMF is not going to tell you exactly its methodology. Because in fact, if they do, they know they'll be found out. You would think something so important, so serious, would actually be widely known. It should be up on the website. These are the data we are using. This is our model. These are the assumptions. These are the numbers we've used. They don't do that. When you try and probe more and more to actually get into details, you discover all kinds of problems with the model. Once you are able to figure out what on earth this model actually is. This is a model that assumes that the less you spend, the more you compress demand, the more you force families to have less and less real income, the higher will be the growth. Doesn't make sense, right? Yet that's essentially part of the drive. That's how it ends up with these very optimistic numbers for how much debt has to be renegotiated. It says, oh, you don't have to really have too much reduction in the debt. 10% is going to be good enough. 15% maybe will be good enough. Because it's expecting growth to happen when everything it is telling that country to do is actually making growth less likely. Yeah? It's the opposite of how the international community looked at debt even in the 1950s. Okay? So let's just remind ourselves that this is not because people don't know. This is not because they haven't thought it through. This is because they are actively choosing a different route. Okay? In the 1950s, Germany had a very large debt. It had come out of the war, Hitler had taken a bunch of debt, but then even after that, the other country, the new government had taken a whole lot of debt. It had a huge unpayable debt. The London Club of Creditors, they met, and they did a major restructuring of Germany's debt. Half of that debt was converted into just regular transfers, so you didn't have to pay half of it. The other half was converted into long-term debt, where the interest payments are capped, maximum of 5% of your export earnings. Imagine if Sri Lanka had that situation today, where you didn't have to pay 15%, 16% of government revenues on debt payment. You could actually link it to your export earnings and say, I will give 5%. Now, obviously, that was a different world, right? It was the Cold War period. The US and Europe were interested in West Germany growing, and that's why this happened, okay? It's political, always it's political. But the point is that idea that a country can grow out of debt, and if you really want success in that economy, you should ensure that it can grow out of debt. The growth is essential for a sustainable debt reduction. That's something they know. It's just that now they're putting in measures that prevent you from doing that. Pretend, and then are very surprised, but it doesn't turn out the way it does, okay? I also want to highlight one other aspect of the whole process of the getting into debt and the trying to get out of debt, which is less discussed often, and that is, if you like, the gender and class dimension, okay? We know that it's the poor who don't really benefit from that period of debt increase. Okay? In Sri Lanka, you know that and you blame it on corruption. But I can assure you that poor people across these 72 countries also didn't really benefit from that period of debt accumulation. But when the crisis happens, when the adjustment happens, it's the poor who are bashed. They are bashed through rising prices of essentials, as was noticed, higher indirect taxes, falling availability of basic public services, less spending on health and education and all of that thing. Among this, again, if you look at women, once again, women very rarely are, if you like, beneficiaries of that period of debt accumulation. But women are major sufferers of that process of adjustment. Why? Because this adjustment relies on the unpaid labor of women. What happens when you cut health spending? Does it mean that the person who needs care is not going to get care? No, that person will get care within the family. The women and girls in the family usually are going to provide the care. What happens when you don't provide adequate nutrition or ensure that families can get adequate nutrition? We know, and in South Asia it is so common. Women and girls, they do self-denial. They choose to eat less. What happened? The incidence of unpaid care work increases dramatically in every crisis, and it's increased dramatically in Sri Lanka as well. And this is something that governments do regularly. Not just in Sri Lanka, they do it in India, they do it everywhere. Governments do this regularly. Why? Because they know they can get away with it. Get away with it in what sense? That if you actually deny the things that the government is supposed to provide, the basic public services it's supposed to provide, will be provided within the family. Care is not going to stop happening. No one is going to say, oh, I'm going to just leave my aged mother on the street because there isn't a facility that is able to look after her. No one is going to say, I'm not going to look after my child because all the public nurseries and creches are closed. They know it will be done. And they know it will be done dominantly by women and girls. So, we used to make a mistake, a lot of us feminist economists, by calling this a gender-blind policy. It isn't a gender-blind policy, it's a gender-exploitative policy. It is governments exploiting that particular aspect of care, which is that it's going to be done anyway, because you care about the people you're caring for. And that you can therefore put more and more burden of unpaid care work on women in that economy. And this is something that is absolutely true in Sri Lanka as well. Now, this in turn means that we have to clearly be much more questioning about the whole IMF strategy. And both Charles and Martin have explained that, I think, very, very clearly. And there are global moves, I think, now, to be considering debt reduction in a way beyond the IMF. Certainly in the United Nations, there's a lot more discussion on debt. There are reports of the UN. There's a report of a high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism, which is making very specific recommendations about debt reduction. In particular, it's saying, if a country applies for a debt reduction, you have to have a standstill on debt. You can't keep adding the interest payments to be added up, so that when you come out of it, you have to pay this huge amount which is double what you started with. It has to be a standstill. And the good thing about a standstill is that it really concentrates the minds of creditors. Then they are actually keen. Then they won't wait 3 years, 5 years, keep you hanging on the sidelines, drive you crazy, etc. They will actually also try and find a solution. This is not something any country can do on its own, but it is something that a global framework could actually put in. And as I said, there are really discussions. There is a financing for development discussion that is they're going to have a big meeting next year in Spain. And there's a separate track on debt which is looking at issues like this, which is thinking about the different ways in which you can address the debt problem. But what do you do if the global system isn't going to deliver tomorrow or next week or next year even? I mean, we know that it's a very lethargic system, right? The UN is a crazy elephant and you don't even know at the end of it how much of it will come out. So what do countries like Sri Lanka do? How do all of you handle this situation? How do you deal with a government that is hell-bent on following the IMF? How do you deal with an economy that is on the route to disaster? Now, let me actually be clear on this. I don't think you should think about it as, oh, we have no alternative but the IMF, because actually saying that is saying that Sri Lanka should actually walk down the precipice. That we know it's going to give us a terrible future and destroy a generation and not allow us to grow, but we have to do it. There is no reason for doing this. You have to be able to say that there is another option, which is, of course, the title of this particular seminar. But there are many ways in which you can actually think about doing it. The first, of course, is what Martin has been telling you. You have to do your own homework. And I don't mean, of course, the government should be doing it. But if the government doesn't do it, civil society must do it. Civil society must go out there and look at the IMF numbers. For example, look at what they promised in their DSA. What was going to be the growth trajectory this year? Have they reached it? Why not? What failed? And I can tell you a lot of it failed for the same reason that we have been saying, that if you are suppressing demand, you are contracting the economy, and then you're very surprised that the economy has contracted and investment is down. You are punishing small, medium, and micro enterprises with very high interest rates, very high electricity costs, very high transport costs, and then you're very surprised when they don't grow and invest. Yeah. You are doing all kinds of things that will only make the economy worse and add to unpaid labor. And then you're extremely surprised and you say, well, it must be that Sri Lanka didn't quite do everything right. And so you have to do more, even more. You have to do even more compression to somehow get that expansion. The last good boy economy that I remember looking at closely was Thailand after the Southeast Asian crisis. And they did everything the IMF said. I mean, to a T, the IMF could not fault them. Every single policy measure they wanted, they got. Okay? And yet the numbers kept getting worse. For the same reason, right? The IMF went through 5 different renegotiations with Thailand because the numbers were just getting worse and worse and worse and worse in 1 year. In 1 year, they went through 5 different agreements. And the IMF insisted, because otherwise they look bad, right? If they are giving this money and they're telling you to do something and you have really not got any of your targets. So the IMF insisted. But if you can say, well, no, I think this is actually going to deliver a completely opposite outcome. I have this other strategy, and I'm going to follow this strategy. There is a case for actually forcing the IMF to listen. Because remember, the world is not exactly the same as it was. The IMF is not the same as it was, but the world is not the same as it was earlier. So of course you have to do your own numbers, you have to look at the IMF numbers, you have to do your own, you have to have your own plan, and you have to have your own projections. But you also have to coordinate with other debtors. It shouldn't just be Charles coming here to tell civil society. It should be people, ministers from Ghana, ministers from Chad, ministers from Belize, ministers from other countries in Latin America, all coming, sharing information, saying, well, look, what did you have in terms of negotiation? How did you do this? Can we do the same? What are they asking from you that they have not asked from us? Can we get together and demand a common strategy that makes more sense to all of us? Because remember, for one country alone to try and negotiate with all these creditors and IMF, it's very difficult. But a bunch of countries together, you're already significantly more in terms of bargaining power. So you have to be able to think. I'm not going to say debtors cartel, because the minute they hear that, they all go up hysterical. Let's just say coordination among debtors. You are sharing information, you are sharing ideas, you are sharing attitudes, approaches, and negotiation techniques. You have to also think about how to bring in legislation. I think Martin mentioned this, to bring the sunlight on all of these negotiations. Governments that are taking on new bond loans, for example, it should go to Parliament. It should be out there on the website that this is what we're doing, and at this interest rate, and for this maturity period, and this coupon rate, and so on. Okay. Similarly, when there is a restructuring or some, if you are signing an agreement with the IMF, before you sign the agreement, legislation should demand parliamentary accountability. It's not just because it's necessary for democracy and justice and civil society and all that. It's because it massively increases your bargaining power. Once you tell the IMF, oh, wait a minute, before you tell me all these conditions, I have to put this to Parliament. You will see how the tune changes. You will get a different result if you are able to say, in my democracy, I can't do this. I can't insist on the following things, because Parliament is going to oppose it. All this also requires, and I go back to the first point, I really think you have to drop, I don't say it's explicit, but I see a lot of implicit sort of guilt and sense of inferiority. You know, there's this whole thing, we mismanaged the economy, we allowed corruption, we were foolish, and now we have to suffer. Because this is a broader process where many, many countries are experiencing this, you are part of a broader process, you have to contest that broader process. And you have to get rid of that sense of guilt and inferiority. Instead, you really have to have confidence. And final point about what do you do if, if suddenly you say, well, I'm not interested anymore in constantly playing around with the bond markets. I'm not going to repay these bond markets because many of them have already got 200% of their original investment back. They don't need it. And then, let's say the bond markets crash. You are not in the bond market right now, and you're not going to be for several years, let's be clear. Whether you like it or not, no matter what the IMF says, you're not going to be. So it doesn't matter if that bond crashes. You should have that confidence to say, you have got more than what you should have got already as returns, that's it. And if the prices of those bonds fall, that's the bondholder's problem. You have to recognize your own strengths. Sri Lanka has a current account surplus, 1.6 billion, last time I looked, for 2023, right? That is double what you're getting every And for the IMF, you're doing all these contortions and this and that, and destroying the pension funds of your workers, destroying the living conditions of all your people. You're doing all that. But you already have 1.6 billion current account surplus. You do not need that money. So essentially, you have to develop the confidence, and you have to be able to think of cooperating and coordinating with other countries that are very much in that same boat, because we all have to prevent that boat from sinking. And I assure you, if we carry on this path, that boat will sink. Okay, thank you.